Well, good afternoon or good morning, whenever you happen to be listening to this. I'm James Bagg and chair of Bivalco, and I'm going to be talking to my partners, Alison and Peter, about the advantages of reviewing the performance of a board in response to the unique challenges they've been facing over the last 5 months, and doing so sooner rather than later, because the temptation must be, of course, to focus on the crisis as it's unfolding rather than looking back and learning any lessons. So my first question really to you, Ali, is why do you view it as important to embark on this review process now rather than putting it back a bit?
Well, there are two things really, James, I would say about the importance of doing a review early rather than later. And that's the first is to do with memory, really. So we have a tendency to reformulate our experiences with either a negative or a positive filter. Or to attribute certain things that we remember to overemphasize the importance of our personal contribution, or to overemphasize the importance of the context. So in essence, our memories are not actually that accurate. And so the sooner that we can actually do a review and make sure that things are captured accurately, the better. And the second reason is about making sense. You know, part of a review process is about processing information and making sense of what's happened to us. And that's a vital part of learning from the experiences that we've had.
So, okay, well, I'm going to talk to Peter in a minute or two about some of the substantive issues that one might like to look at. But Ali, I'd like to ask you about the structure of this review, doing it in a way in which gives rise to sort of creative outcomes, rather than just simply saying what went right and what didn't go so well. So perhaps you could give us the benefit of your wisdom really about how you might structure this process.
Yeah, I think as you say, the temptation is when you sort of embark upon a sort of review conversation to just focus on the past. So what seems to have gone well, what's not gone well, and that's a conversation which can be enriching. But the challenge is people tend to come at that conversation from such a diversity of direction. Often it's hard for people to coalesce around the most important things. So I always suggest that a good structure has sort of 5 to 6 components of it, really. And one that we often recommend would be a focus on culture. So how has the behaviour of the board impacted the way things get done? Roles would be a second thing. So how's the board's role changed during the pandemic? And how might we want to keep some of those changes for the future, or actually revert to what we were doing before? Look at processes. To what extent have we had to change our process? Many boards have had to change, for example, how dynamic their board information is. So do we want to keep those changes, or actually are there ways that we could be more efficient? Strategy would be a fourth topic. So most boards have had to change their strategy on the fly to deal with the current pandemic. There's no doubt about that. But really importantly, are we focusing on the right things now? And if we look forward, what are the consequences of the strategic changes that we've made? Beliefs. This is something that boards often don't look at it enough, but how are our beliefs really shaping the decision that we're making? And perhaps importantly, are we really surfacing what our beliefs are and speaking openly about how those beliefs are influencing the decisions we're making? And then finally, a look at our values. So are we using our values effectively as a backbone to help us make decisions and difficult choices? So there's 6 simple headings: culture, roles, process, strategy, beliefs, and values.
Is there, help me about the difference between beliefs and values.
Well, beliefs are often, I'd say beliefs are often below the surface. Sometimes people's beliefs are unspoken, and they unconsciously shape the way we think about things. So they can influence us to put forward particular suggestions in a particular way. Whereas on a board, your values, your personal values, aside, the board should have a collective set of values which it's working to. So they are a framework from which the board can make decisions.
And obviously, one of the critical operating features of a good board is the relationship between the executives and the non-executives. And I'm just wondering how and where that fits in with that particular structure that you've recommended.
Well, I'd say two sort of areas there. One would be around role. So, for example, many boards that I've worked with through the pandemic, there is no doubt that the non-exec role has changed to become much more hands-on. And often, many boards have said their relationship between the exec and the non-exec has actually got better through the pandemic. So I think by having a conversation about role, it's a good time to say, have we swung the non-exec role a little bit too far into the executive space, or do we need to swing it back? Has there been sufficient challenge, sufficient support? You know, have we got the balance right?
Peter, turning to you now and looking at some of the substantive issues that the board might be wanting to look at given the current climate. Perhaps you could talk a bit about what you think are the sort of major issues at the moment.
Yeah, I think, James, one of the first things boards should be thinking about is the way they communicate. And that's not just communication with clients, although obviously that's important, but the way they communicate with staff, because we've entered a world where for a lot of businesses, people are working remotely. And that's a question of looking after staff, but it's also making sure that you enforce and reinforce the messages that staff need to think about when they're doing their work. And even before this crisis, I think Ali and I have worked on matters where we've seen boards take on specialist expertise, specialist non-executive directors with communication skills to help develop the way in which the ideas and the purpose and in fact many of the things that Ali's just been talking about, in a way, how those are communicated to staff, how they are filtered down through to staff, so that they feel part of the project. And it's a real challenge, I think, at the moment, given where we are with the crisis, to keep doing that. So that expertise is perhaps one area that directors should be looking at, boards should be looking at.
That's particularly important in this environment where there are so many redundancies, and obviously the impact that it's going to have on those members of the staff that remain. So sort of culture and values there seems to me to be pretty critical.
It's tremendously destabilizing for the staff that remain. That's often, I think, forgotten. You know, obviously people focus on those that have lost the job, but the effect on morale, it can often be really quite significant.
Yeah. And have you got another example, perhaps, of the substantive issues that you think are real for most boards in this current climate?
I think one of the other things which boards should be thinking about is the extent to which their business models need to change to reflect what's happened, because an awful lot has happened in a very short time, as we all know, and the way in which much of business has gone online in a way which wasn't the case before the pandemic. And I think we're all quite familiar with the retail businesses having to cope with sales on the internet and so on. There's been a lot about the way that department stores have suffered, etc. But I also think business to business is also being affected. It's not just retail businesses. And I was talking to a friend of a friend recently who was telling me about the way in which it appears to be affecting some of those who are active in things like office supplies, where traditionally there's been quite a lot of direct contact between suppliers and the businesses that consume those supplies, and that might be your sort of traditional sales reps and that sort of thing. But clearly during the pandemic, that's not been possible, and it would appear that businesses consuming those sort of that type of office supply have got used to the idea that they're going to order their pen and paper online rather than waiting for someone to come around. So, if that's continued post the pandemic, that's going to be a complete change to the way those businesses are run, and boards are going to have to think about what that means. And there may well be a need for expertise on IT and so on to help develop a sort of an online business going forward.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said prompts me to reflect on one of the major worries that I have of the impact it's having on the much younger members of staff. And their own personal development, because the tendency now is to talk about how easy it is to work from home. Why do I need to go into the office?
Yeah.
It seems to me that boards are now going to have to really sit down and think about the future and think about, developing, younger members of staff and creating new work environments, notwithstanding the particular difficulties.
I think that's right. I mean, things like training are, pretty difficult to do online in a way. I mean, you can do some things, but as we all know, they've got their limitations, and trying to develop training for the virtual world is a challenge.
Going back to the review itself, we've spoken about some of the substantive issues and the structures, and I really have a quick chat now about the how. Really, does this have to be a triennial review, or is there a quicker and easier way of doing it, Ali?
Well, I think there are two things here, aren't there? One is a review of how the board has performed, how effective the board has been, and what can we learn from that through the crisis, and what does it need to change at this point in time, given what's coming down the pipeline. And that might be more of a light touch review. The second is that continuation of just good governance practice, which is to continue to do those triennial reviews. And of course, many boards have delayed their triennial review for good reason, because of the crisis. But there comes a point where you have to say it is important to do those triennial reviews. It's good practice, it's good governance, and to delay them for too long is just the wrong thing to do.
I mean, Peter, you've got experience in the regulatory world. I mean, have you a sense of what the regulators will be asking for or looking for here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, James. I mean, if you look at what the regulators have put out, financial services regulators, actually, it's interesting. There haven't been significant concessions on the obligations which sit with firms. In practice, no doubt there'll be a bit of flex, and I think we're all familiar with that. But actually, there is no sort of carte blanche. Don't worry, let's get through this, and then you can pick up these obligations again. They all remain, and firms, financial services firms, need to comply with the regime as if they were in normal times. There may well be flex, as I say, but in practice, none of the rules have been turned off or anything like that. So when it comes to governance, I mean, there's probably an argument to say it becomes more important in times like this than perhaps it would be in normal times. And I think for those firms, if they got into difficulties with the regulator, it's worth remembering it takes time for the thing to come to a head. So, in 18 months' time or 2 years' time, when they're explaining to the regulator in some detail as to why they didn't do something, people will begin to forget. To use Ali's point at the beginning, I think, of this, their memories are relatively short, and regulators are not perhaps going to be that sympathetic. If something's gone wrong and they put it down to a governance issue, it's not going to be that attractive, I think, to argue, well, we put it off, because we felt it wasn't appropriate at the time.
Now, in a rather more self-serving mode, Ali, perhaps you could talk to me about the advantages of, the self-assessment or using an external facilitator, and where you think the external facilitator could really add to this review process.
Well, I think regardless of what sort of review it is, the point of having an external facilitator fits under three headings, really. The first is about the external facilitator allows the chair to contribute to the conversation. And of course, what the chair has learnt is as important as what other board members have learnt. So that's a really, their point of view is really valuable. The second, I think, is that the independent reviewers come in with just a fresh perspective. And when a team has been working so close in often very long hours during the crisis, just having somebody who's got a fresh point of view and will see things from a different perspective and can ask those tangential questions, means that you're more likely to get a different sense and a clearer view and a clearer set of actions out of it. And I think the third thing really is that inevitably there are some unspoken matters or matters of conflict or confrontation that will have been pushed beneath the table for good reason, because there wasn't time to resolve them or sort them through. And actually a review time is a point where everyone can just press that pause button and just reflect on those moments of conflict and confrontation and just, you know, ask the question, how did we resolve that? Did we resolve it effectively or not? And someone external is much more likely to be able to surface those types of conversations. So that's not to say that internal review conversations are not useful without a facilitator, but somebody needs to facilitate. You know, facilitation is a really important part of any process. So I think, you know, there's good reason for both, but just remember you do need a facilitator.
Well, look, thank you both very much for your contribution to this. You know, the lessons are obvious ones, you know, better sooner rather than later, we feel, because otherwise memories get a little dulled over time, and the action points might be somewhat less creative than they would be if ineffective. So thank you both, and perhaps we'll speak again in due course.